The slap lands before anyone in the room understands why, and for half a second, nobody breathes. Not the string quartet in the corner, not the caterers holding their trays at the kitchen door, not Preston Vale, standing 2 feet away in a suit that cost more than Daniel's truck. Vanessa's palm is still raised when she says it, loud enough for the whole room to catch every word. "You embarrass me," she says. "You have always embarrassed me."
Daniel Whitfield does not touch his face. He does not move at all. 41 people in cocktail attire watch a logistics engineer in a department store blazer get told in front of his wife's lover's entire social circle that he has never once been enough.
Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories filled with betrayal, secrets, and unforgettable revenge, don't forget to subscribe to Plight Stories, because this story, it only gets crazier from here. The room does not move yet. Somewhere behind Daniel, ice settles in a glass. Vanessa is still waiting for him to flinch. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the marble foyer, not Preston Vale's company, not the version of Vanessa who has learned to enjoy being looked at by people who matter. 3 years earlier, there was just a kitchen table in a rented house in East Charlotte, a leaking faucet Daniel had fixed himself on a Sunday morning, and a marriage that, for a while, made complete sense. Daniel had met Vanessa at a community college night class. Neither of them needed. Him for a certificate he never used, her for credits toward a business degree she eventually finished alone, because by the 2nd year of their marriage, he was working 60-hour weeks at a freight logistics company and writing code in the evenings that nobody had asked him to write. He liked the quiet of it. He liked solving a routing problem until 2 in the morning and feeling, for an hour, like the world made sense in a way that people rarely did. Vanessa liked him then. She used to sit on the counter while he cooked, asking him to explain what he was building, not because she understood it, but because she liked watching him want something that badly. There was a night, early in their 2nd year of marriage, that Daniel still thought about more than he would have admitted. Their car had broken down on a 2-lane road outside Statesville. No signal, no tow truck answering, and instead of panicking, Vanessa had climbed up to sit on the hood with him. In February, both of them wrapped in the same blanket from the trunk, and she'd said she liked this, not despite the trouble, but because of how calm he was inside it. She told him that night that she never worried about anything when he was the one handling it. He believed her completely. He would spend years afterward trying to figure out exactly when that belief had stopped being true for her, and he never quite located the date, because people rarely announce the moment they start wanting something different. They just slowly stop sitting on hoods in February. What Vanessa did not know, what nobody but one woman in Atlanta knew, was that the routing software Daniel built in those evenings was not a hobby. It was the seed of something he never planned to keep. In his 4th year of marriage, a small logistics startup out of Charlotte licensed an early version of his routing algorithm for almost nothing because Daniel did not know how to negotiate and did not particularly care to learn. He asked for cash and equity instead of a higher salary because equity was the only thing he understood better than the man across the table from him. The company was called Vale Dynamics. It had 4 employees and a founder named Preston Vale, who wore a suit to a meeting that should have required jeans. Daniel kept the equity in a small holding company a college friend, Renee Okafor, helped him set up. Quietly, deliberately, in a structure with a name boring enough that nobody who saw it on paper would look twice. Meridian Capital Partners. Renee, by then 3 years into a corporate law career she found mostly dull, had taken the work almost as a favor, never imagining it would become the largest, strangest, most consequential file of her career. The first purchase was small, a follow-on round in year 2, $11,000 Daniel scraped together by selling a motorcycle he'd never finished restoring. just enough to keep Meridian's percentage from being diluted into irrelevance. Nobody at Veil Dynamics asked who Meridian was. Small checks rarely earn questions. Over the following years, as Veil Dynamics raised round after round, and Daniel's algorithm became the backbone of its entire delivery network, Renee did something Daniel asked her to do without asking why twice. Every time Veil Dynamics needed a quiet investor willing to take dilution other funds wouldn't touch, every time a smaller logistics company supplying Veil's network went up for sale, every time a piece of infrastructure Veil depended on came onto the market, Meridian Capital was there, buying in small, unglamorous, undramatic amounts. A failing regional carrier in Toledo. A warehouse automation firm in Reno that Veil's own engineers quietly depended on, and nobody at Veil had thought to acquire outright. A 6% secondary stake sold quietly by an early seed investor who wanted liquidity for a divorce of his own and never once met the buyer on the other side of the wire transfer. Each purchase, alone, looked like nothing. Together, compounding year over year, they became something else entirely. By the time Veil Dynamics was valued near $30 billion and preparing to go public, Meridian Capital Partners controlled, through a structure that took 4 law firms and 2 years to fully map, just over 51% of the voting shares. Daniel Whitfield owned the company his wife's future lover would one day run his life into the ground believing he owned. He never told Vanessa. This was not strategy. It would have been easy strategy. A man who tells his wife he is worth 9 figures rarely loses her attention. But Daniel had grown up watching his father's business partner marry his mother's best friend for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with what showed up on a balance sheet. And he had promised himself, quietly, the kind of promise a person makes only to themselves, that if he ever built anything, he would find out first whether anyone could love the version of him that built it without knowing what it was worth. He wanted, more than he wanted comfort, more than he wanted recognition, to know that what he had with Vanessa was real, before the money made it impossible to ever know that again. So he drove a 10-year-old Tacoma. He kept working at the freight company. He let Vanessa believe his evenings of coding were a strange, harmless hobby, the kind of thing quiet men do instead of watching television. For a while, it worked, in the sense that it was true. Vanessa loved him for the small things, the way he fixed things himself, the way he listened without needing to talk over her, the steadiness of him on the nights her father called drunk and angry from 3 states away. But somewhere around year 5, something in her shifted, slow enough that neither of them named it. Her business degree led to a job at a marketing firm that did work for tech companies, and at Industry Mixers, she started meeting men who wore the kind of watches Daniel would never buy himself, even if he could, and she started coming home with a particular kind of quiet that Daniel recognized but could not yet name. She began describing his job at parties with a small, apologetic laugh. He's in logistics. It's very boring. Don't ask him about it. And Daniel noticed and said nothing, because saying something would have required explaining everything, and he was not ready. And some nights he told himself he was protecting them both, and other nights he was honest enough with himself to know he was protecting an idea of being loved that he was terrified to test. It happened more than once, in more rooms than Daniel ever mentioned out loud. At her firm's holiday party 2 years ago, a colleague asked what Daniel did, and Vanessa answered for him before he'd finished setting down his drink. The same 3 words. Logistics. It's boring. Followed by a quick pivot to a story about her own client work, as though his answer had used up the room's patience before he'd spoken at all. At her cousin's engagement dinner the following spring, when someone mentioned a stock tip, Vanessa had laughed and said Daniel didn't really understand investing. He was more of a hands-on person, and the table had laughed with her, gently, the way tables laugh at husbands who are being affectionately diminished. And Daniel had smiled along, because the alternative was a conversation he was not yet ready to have. Each time, he told himself it was small, each time, it left a thin layer of sediment neither of them could see accumulating until the morning it would matter. The marketing firm's biggest account, 18 months ago, became Vail Dynamics. Vanessa met Preston Vail in a conference room 3 blocks from the freight company where her own husband had once licensed away the algorithm that built Preston's fortune, and neither of them knew it. And the irony sat there, invisible, for a year and a half, accumulating like interest. Preston Vail was everything Daniel had decided a long time ago not to become. He filled rooms before he entered them. He told stories about himself in the third person without noticing. He had built, or believed he had built, alone with his own hands, the way men like Preston always believe, a $30 billion logistics empire on the back of a routing algorithm he had once paid almost nothing for and never once thought about again. He liked to tell new hires that he had founded Vail Dynamics out of a garage with $900 and a vision, which was technically true and almost entirely beside the point, since the $900 had bought him a license he never fully understood the value of from a quiet man who had not bothered to negotiate, and who, if anyone had asked, would have told them negotiating was never really the point. He did not know that the quiet holding company that kept showing up on his cap table updates, the one his CFO mentioned twice and he never asked about, belonged to the husband of the woman he was sleeping with. He did not know because he had never once in 4 years asked who actually owned the votes. Vanessa fell for the noise of him. Not all at once. She would have told you, if you'd asked her honestly, that she never meant for it to become what it became. It became what it became one dinner, one industry party, one late-night call about a campaign deadline at a time, each one small enough to explain away, until the explaining away became its own kind of relationship. She told herself she was lonely. She told herself Daniel had stopped trying. She did not let herself look directly at the truth, which was that she had started measuring her own worth by the size of the room a man could fill, and Daniel filled no room at all, by design, on purpose, for reasons she had never once asked him about, because she had stopped being curious about him long before she stopped wearing her ring. The party where it ended was Preston's idea, a private celebration 2 weeks before the announced IPO roadshow for what he was calling, to the small invited circle of investors and friends, 30 billion reasons to celebrate. Vanessa asked Daniel to come. He suspected by then more than he let on, but he came anyway, in the same blazer he'd worn to her cousin's wedding, because some part of him needed to see the shape of what he already knew before he let himself believe it. He saw it within 10 minutes. Vanessa's hand on Preston's arm in a way that wasn't friendly. The particular laugh she gave Preston's jokes, louder, brighter, performed for an audience that included her husband. The way she had positioned herself the entire night so that anyone who looked at the room would understand exactly what they were looking at. Daniel stood near the bar with a glass of water he didn't drink and watched his wife rehearse, in real time, the story she would tell people about why she'd left. A few feet away, Preston's chief of staff, a woman named Lindsay, who had clearly seen versions of this scene before at other parties with other wives, kept glancing toward Daniel with something close to pity, refilling his water without being asked, the way people do for someone they suspect is about to be embarrassed in public and would like to soften the landing in whatever small way they can. 2 investors near the cheese table were already discussing the IPO roadshow timeline, oblivious, their voices carrying the specific confidence of men who believed they understood exactly what they were buying into. It came to a head near the windows, where a small crowd had gathered to hear Preston tell, for what was clearly not the first time, the story of building Vail Dynamics from nothing. Someone asked Daniel, politely, what he did. Logistics, Vanessa answered for him, before he could speak. The same apologetic laugh from 100 other parties. Except this time, Preston laughed too, and put his hand on the small of Vanessa's back, and said something about how some people build empires, and some people just move boxes around. And the room laughed with him. And Vanessa did not stop them. Daniel set his glass down. He did not raise his voice. He looked at his wife, at the hand on her back, at the room full of people who had decided collectively, in under a minute, exactly what kind of man he was. "I've spent 4 years listening to you apologize for me at parties," he said. "I'd like to know what I did, specifically, to embarrass you tonight." It was the longest thing he'd said all evening, and it was 4 sentences, and his voice did not rise on a single one of them. This was the moment Vanessa made the mistake the whole rest of her life would trace back to. She could have stayed quiet. She could have pulled him aside. Instead, with Preston's hand still on her back and 30 of his closest friends still watching, she said the thing she had clearly been holding for months, maybe years. The thing that had been building underneath every apologetic laugh at every party before this one. "I have been ashamed of you for years," she said, loud enough that the string quartet actually paused. "You fix faucets and write code nobody asked for, and you think that's a personality? I am so tired of explaining you to people." And then, because some final reckless part of her wanted an exclamation point on it, she slapped him. Not hard, not a real blow, more theater than violence. The kind of slap designed to be seen rather than felt, and said the words that opened this story. "You embarrass me. You have always embarrassed me." 41 people did not breathe. Preston, to his credit, looked briefly uncomfortable, the way a man looks when a scene has gone slightly further than the entertainment he was hoping for. Daniel did not touch his face. He looked at Vanessa for 3 full seconds, long enough that several people in the room would later describe it as the strangest silence they'd ever stood inside. Then he said the only thing he said. "All right." That was all. No raised voice, no plea, no scene of his own to match hers. He picked his jacket up off the back of a chair, nodded once to nobody in particular, and walked out through the marble foyer he had, in a sense, helped pay for, into a parking lot full of cars worth more than his house, and drove home in his 10-year-old Tacoma, while Vanessa stayed at the party, unbothered, already laughing again within the hour, stepping fully and finally into a version of her life she believed she had finally earned. Daniel did not call anyone that night. He sat at the same kitchen table where the marriage had once made sense, in a house that suddenly felt larger than it was, and for 2 hours he did nothing at all except listen to the faucet he'd fixed years ago drip exactly once every 40 seconds, a sound he had always found satisfying because it meant the fix was almost perfect, just not quite. He thought, oddly, not about Vanessa, but about the night on the hood of the car outside Statesville. The blanket, the cold, the version of her who had once said she never worried about anything when he was the one handling it. He wondered when that woman had stopped existing, or whether she had ever existed at all, or whether he had simply been the kind of man who needed her to exist badly enough that he'd built her out of a handful of good nights and called it a marriage. He did not cry. He did not throw anything. He simply sat with the quiet, the way he sat with everything. And somewhere in the second hour, the question that had been circling him for years finally landed and stayed. He had spent 4 years hiding the truth to find out if he was loved without it. And tonight, finally, completely, without any more room for doubt, he had his answer. Around 11, he picked up his phone and called Renee Okafor, who answered on the second ring, even though it was a Saturday night, because Renee had been waiting, in some quiet professional corner of her mind, for this call for longer than either of them would admit. "It's time," Daniel said. That was the entire message. Renee did not ask him if he was sure. She had drafted every document for this exact moment 2 years ago, refreshed quarterly, sitting untouched in a folder labeled, with the kind of dry humor lawyers allow themselves, contingency, do not file until instructed. What followed over the next 11 days was not an attack. Daniel would have rejected that word if anyone had used it to his face, because attacks are improvised, and what happened to Preston Vale's company was not improvised at all. It had been engineered, patiently, 2 years in advance, The way a person builds a levee long before the flood arrives, hoping never to need it, building it anyway because hope is not a plan. The first domino was procedural and almost invisible. Meridian Capital Partners' general counsel filed a routine disclosure with the SEC, required of any holder crossing certain thresholds ahead of an IPO roadshow, formally identifying Meridian as the holder of 51.4% of Veil Dynamics voting shares. It landed in the inbox of exactly the people who needed to see it: the IPO underwriters' compliance team, the lead investment bank's general counsel, 2 members of Veil Dynamics' own board who had never once met the man behind Meridian Capital and had simply assumed, the way people assume things that are convenient, that the entity was a passive financial player happy to ride along. The filing did not make news. It did not need to. It simply existed now, where it could not be unseen. The second domino was a letter, delivered by courier rather than email, so there could be no claim it had been missed, exercising Meridian's contractual right, written into the very first investment documents Daniel had signed 4 years earlier, when Preston was too eager for cash to read the fine print closely, to appoint 2 seats on Veil Dynamics' board with immediate effect, ahead of any public listing. Preston's general counsel called an emergency meeting. Preston, for the first time in 4 years, asked who exactly was behind Meridian Capital Partners, and was told, by his own CFO, with visible discomfort, that nobody had ever actually confirmed it, because the quarterly checks had always cleared and the votes had always, conveniently, aligned with management's recommendations, right up until the moment they didn't have to anymore. The third domino was the quietest and the most devastating, because it did not arrive as a document at all. It arrived as silence. The silence of 3 smaller logistics firms in Ohio, Tennessee, and Nevada, each one a critical node in Veil Dynamics' delivery network, each one quietly owned in full by Meridian subsidiaries Daniel had assembled over 2 years, specifically because Veil's own engineers, in a cost-cutting decision made before Preston had ever heard Daniel's name, had outsourced exactly the regional hubs that could not be rebuilt quickly. On the 9th day, all 3 hubs received a single coordinated instruction from their new ownership: pause all new routing contracts with Veil Dynamics, pending a 30-day operational review. It was legal. It was contractually permitted under terms Veil's own lawyers had signed off on years earlier without reading closely enough. It was also, functionally, a hand closing slowly around a throat that did not yet understand it was being held. The fourth domino was the one Preston's CFO would later describe, in a deposition nobody outside the company ever read, as the moment he understood the company was no longer his to manage. A routine line of credit Veil Dynamics depended on for payroll smoothing between funding rounds had been quietly purchased 8 months earlier by a fund whose limited partnership agreement traced back, through 2 more layers nobody had bothered to unwind, to Meridian Capital. The lender did not call the loan. It simply declined, politely, to extend the customary grace period on the next covenant review, a decision that meant nothing to anyone outside finance and meant everything to anyone inside it, because it meant the company's cash runway had quietly shortened by 4 critical weeks at the exact moment it could least afford to. Daniel did not gloat. He did not check the stock-adjacent chatter on financial forums, though Renee told him, twice, that people were starting to talk. Inside Veil Dynamics, the board convened twice in 5 days, both times without a clear answer to the only question anyone wanted asked aloud: who is Daniel Whitfield, and why does he own us? Preston's CFO, a careful man named Greg Aldarando, who had spent a decade building a reputation for diligence, found himself explaining to 2 independent directors that he had simply never confirmed the identity behind a shareholder whose checks, for years, had always cleared on time. It was the kind of sentence that ends careers quietly, months later, in conversations nobody schedules until they have to. He went to work at the freight company on Monday like always, fixed a leaking pipe under his sister's kitchen sink on Wednesday because she'd asked him weeks ago, and picked his daughter up from her school's spring play on Thursday evening, sitting in a folding chair in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax, clapping for a third grader playing a tree, while 300 miles away, a $30 billion IPO roadshow was quietly, procedurally, irreversibly coming apart at the seams. The roadshow's final investor presentation, the one meant to close the largest funding round in the company's history, was held in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown tower. 40-some investors in the room, and twice that many watching remotely. Screens behind Preston Vale displaying growth charts that climbed at angles designed to be remembered. Vanessa was there, seated in the second row beside Preston's chief of staff, wearing a dress that had cost more than anything Daniel had ever bought her, because Preston had asked her to come, had wanted, the way he wanted most things, a witness. Preston was 11 minutes into his presentation, on the slide about regional distribution efficiency, the same regional hubs that had gone quiet 9 days earlier, conveniently smoothed over in his deck with a footnote about ongoing operational optimization, when the lead investor in the front row, a woman named Carol Iyer who managed money for a sovereign wealth fund and had not once raised her hand all morning, raised it now. "Before we continue," she said, not unkindly, the way people say things when they already know the answer and are simply being polite about asking, "can someone explain why your cap table shows a majority shareholder I've never heard of who filed paperwork 9 days ago, holding board seats nobody mentioned in the data room?" She held up her phone. The email had arrived in her inbox 22 minutes earlier, forwarded by her own diligence team, the SEC filing attached as a PDF nobody on Preston's side had thought to flag before the room filled up. Preston's smile did not leave his face immediately. That was its own kind of tragedy, watching a man's confidence survive for 3 or 4 extra seconds after the information that should have ended it had already arrived. He said something about a routine financial restructuring. His CFO, 3 seats down, did not back him up, because his CFO had spent the last week trying and failing to get Meridian Capital's general counsel to confirm a single detail beyond the legal minimum, and had concluded, privately, that whoever controlled 51% of his company had no intention of being friendly about it. It was Carol Iyer who said the name, because she had done, in 22 minutes, the homework someone inside the building should have done years ago. "Meridian Capital Partners," she said, reading from her screen. "Registered agent, sole controlling member, Daniel Whitfield." She looked up. "Is that the Daniel Whitfield who licensed your original routing patent? Because that's what the filing's history search says." Beside Carol, a second investor, a quiet pension fund manager named Howard Lutz, who had said almost nothing all morning, pulled up the same filing on his own phone, scrolled once, and set the phone face down on the table without comment. The particular gesture of a man who has just decided privately and completely that he will not be writing a check today, regardless of how the next 10 minutes unfold. 2 analysts near the back exchanged a glance and began typing, quietly, the kind of typing that ends up as a headline by the following morning. The room did the thing rooms do in the half-second before they fully understand something. A kind of collective stillness, screens forgotten, charts forgotten, 40 investors recalculating, in real time, exactly how much of what they'd been told about Vale Dynamics' ownership and control had simply never been true. Vanessa's understanding arrived a few seconds behind the rooms, the way understanding sometimes does when the thing it's built on is too large to absorb quickly. She had heard the name before. Of course she had. She'd been married to it for 6 years. But it took her brain a long, strange moment to connect the man in the SEC filing to the man who used to fix faucets, because those 2 facts had simply never been allowed in the same room together before. When the connection finally landed, it did not arrive as a gasp. It arrived as something quieter and much worse. The slow, total understanding that the husband she had spent years apologizing for at parties was the reason the man beside her had ever had a party worth attending. She found Daniel 2 days later, not at a confrontation, not at a courthouse, but in the parking lot of the freight company, because she had nowhere else she could think to look, and some instinct told her he would be exactly where he had always been. He was getting into the Tacoma when she called his name. He stopped. He did not look surprised to see her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice did not have the performance in it anymore. There was no audience left to perform for. Daniel considered the question the way he considered most things. "Because I wanted someone who could love a man who fixes faucets," he said, before she ever had to find out he could buy the company that made them irrelevant. He did not say it cruelly. He said it like a man reading a verdict he had already accepted a long time ago, in a kitchen, alone. The night the marriage he'd hoped for quietly became the marriage he actually had. Then he got in the truck and drove away, and he did not look back to see what was on her face, because he already knew, and watching it would not have changed anything for either of them. The week after the pitch belonged to other people. Valley Dynamics board, in an emergency session that ran past midnight, formally accepted Meridian's nominees and began the search for outside leadership. Greg Alderondo resigned before anyone could ask him to, citing personal reasons nobody in the room bothered to dispute. Preston spent 3 days trying to reach Daniel directly, through emails Renee's office returned unread, and a phone number that had been changed the same week the first filing landed, before finally accepting, the way men like Preston eventually have to accept most things, that the call simply was not going to happen. 6 months later, Vale Dynamics still exists, technically, under a restructured board and a new CEO recruited from outside, but it is a smaller, quieter company than the one Preston Vale used to describe at parties. Its valuation cut by more than half, its IPO indefinitely shelved, its regional hubs slowly, expensively rebuilt under contracts that no longer favor the founder who once assumed he would never need to read the fine print. Preston works out of a leased office a third the size of his old one, in a building 2 blocks from where the celebration party was held, close enough that he can see the old tower from his window if he chooses to, which Greg Alderondo says he does not. He still tells the story of building something from nothing, but fewer people ask him to tell it now, and the ones who do tend to already know how it ends. Vanessa moved into an apartment near the marketing firm, alone, in a building considerably less impressive than the foyer where she once raised her hand to a man's face. The friends who filled Preston's parties did not follow her there. Proximity, it turned out, had been the entire relationship, and proximity does not survive a $30 billion correction. 2 of the women who used to invite her to industry mixers stopped responding to her texts within weeks, and a third, more honest than the rest, told her plainly over coffee that she liked Vanessa fine, but had liked the parties more. Vanessa works the same job she worked before, goes to the same gym, sees the same small circle of people who knew her before any of it, and carries, quietly, the specific weight of having once said the truest, cruelest thing she ever felt out loud, in a room full of witnesses, to the one person who turned out to be holding the only thing that mattered. She has not, as of this telling, reached out to him again, and those who know her best say she does not intend to, not out of pride, but because she has finally run out of things to say that would not sound like an excuse. Daniel is unchanged in every way that matters. He still drives the Tacoma, though Renee has, twice, gently suggested he consider a car that better reflects his net worth, and twice he has told her the truck still runs fine. He still works at the freight company, 3 days a week now instead of 6, mostly because his daughter asked him to be at more of her school things, and he found, once he allowed himself to consider it, that there was nothing in his calendar more important than that. He was at her school play again last month. She played a slightly larger tree this time, and he clapped the same way he always claps, with his whole hand, fully, like a man who has never once needed an audience to know what he's worth. On the drive home that night, his daughter asked him, the way kids ask things, sideways, whether he was rich. He told her he had enough, which was true, and that the difference between enough and a lot was mostly just noise, which she did not fully understand yet, and which he hoped, quietly, she would understand a great deal more slowly than he had. Renee Okafor still manages Meridian Capital, now considerably larger and considerably more visible than the boring shell she helped a college friend set up over a decade ago. And she has told a small number of people, in private, that the file she once labeled contingency, do not file until instructed, was the most consequential piece of paper she has ever drafted. Not because of the money it eventually protected, but because of what it told her about the man who asked her to draft it, without ever once explaining why. She has never repeated that conversation to anyone outside the firm, and she does not plan to, because some things, she has decided, are simply not anyone else's to know. He never gave an interview about what happened at Veil Dynamics. He never posted anything. The story traveled the way these stories travel, through people who were in the room, through investors who couldn't stop talking about the 22 minutes that changed everything, through a small circle that grew slowly into a much larger one, until eventually it reached you, here, now, listening to a version of it that finally has all the pieces in the right order. One of Veil Dynamics' junior engineers, a woman who had spent 2 years building the very regional routing logic that traced back to Daniel's original algorithm, later said the strangest part wasn't the money or the filing. It was realizing that the quiet man occasionally mentioned in old emails as the original licenser had been a real, specific, ordinary person the whole time, and that nobody had ever bothered to ask what he was like. So here is the question worth sitting with after the screen goes dark. Vanessa spent years rehearsing an apology for a man she had decided, long before any of this began, was not enough. And the only thing that ever changed her mind was a number on a filing, not a single thing about who he actually was. Daniel never needed her to apologize. He only ever needed to know once and for all whether the apology would have come without the number at all. So tell me, if the spreadsheet had said something smaller, would she have ever been wrong at all in her own mind? Or is it only money that makes us go back and rewrite the value of someone we already decided to throw away?